My daughter-in-law stole my credit card. The next day, I saw the bill, $53,000 in jewelry and a trip. On Monday, she texted me, "Love the gifts, mother-in-law." I smiled because the card she used. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." My hands trembled as I stared at the credit card statement, the numbers blurring through tears I refused to let fall. $53,000 in a single day. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read each line item, each purchase more outrageous than the last. Tiffany & Co. and $18,000. Cartier, $22,000. Premium spa package, $3,500. First-class tickets to Paris, $9,500. I sank into my kitchen chair, the same one where Harold and I used to share our morning coffee for 38 years before cancer took him 3 years ago. The statement felt like ice in my hands, but my face burned with humiliation. How could I have been so stupid, so trusting? The worst part wasn't even the money, though $53,000 was more than I'd ever spent on myself in a single year. The worst part was the text message that had arrived this morning, cheerful and mocking. "Loved the treats, mother-in-law. Thanks for being so generous. Zuri." I read it again, my chest tightening with each word, the casual cruelty of it, the assumption that I would just accept it, that I was too old, too weak, too dependent on maintaining peace to fight back. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Zuri. "Tyson and I are having such an amazing time in Paris. The suite is incredible. You should see the view from our balcony." Attached were photos. My daughter-in-law posing in what looked like a 5-star hotel, wearing jewelry I'd never be able to afford, her smile radiant with satisfaction. In one photo, she held up a champagne glass and a mock toast. The diamond bracelet on her wrist caught the light like a spotlight on my humiliation. I set the phone down with shaking hands and walked to the window overlooking my small backyard. Harold had planted those roses before he got sick. I'd been tending them alone for 3 years now, just like I'd been tending everything alone. The house felt too big and too quiet, but it was mine. At least I'd thought it was secure. The credit card had been in my purse, tucked safely in my wallet. Or so I believed. When had Zuri taken it? During last Sunday's dinner when she'd insisted on helping me clear the dishes, when she'd hugged me goodbye, pressing close enough to slip her fingers into my purse. The thought made my skin crawl. I'd been so grateful for any affection from her, so desperate to be included in my son's new life. 3 years of marriage, and I'd tried everything to win Zuri over. I'd complimented her clothes, praised her cooking, agreed with her opinions even when they stung. When she suggested I was getting forgetful in front of Tyson, I'd laughed it off. When she'd rolled her eyes at my stories about Harold, I'd stopped telling them. When she'd made subtle comments about how outdated my house was, I'd actually considered renovating. All because I was terrified of losing Tyson, my only child, my baby who'd once run to me with scraped knees and bad dreams. The son who'd held my hand at his father's funeral and promised he'd never leave me alone. But somewhere along the way, I'd lost him anyway. The phone rang, jolting me from my thoughts. Tyson's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe he'd discovered what Zuri had done. Maybe he was calling to apologize, to tell me they were coming home to make things right. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, Mom." His voice sounded distant, tired. "Look, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." My grip tightened on the phone. "Of course, Tyson. What is it?" "Zuri says you gave her permission to use your credit card for our anniversary trip. She says you insisted on treating us, but now she's worried you might be having second thoughts about the amount." The words hit me like a physical blow. The carefully constructed lie, the way she'd twisted everything to make me look like a confused old woman who couldn't keep track of her own decisions. And worse, the fact that my son believed her without question. "Tyson," I said carefully, "I never gave anyone permission to use my credit card." Silence stretched between us. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of frustration I knew well. "Mom, come on. Zuri showed me the messages where you told her to treat herself. She said you were excited about surprising us." "What messages? I never sent any messages about—" "Maybe you forgot. You've been under a lot of stress lately, and Dr. Peterson did mention that grief can affect memory sometimes. Dr. Peterson, my family physician for 15 years. When had Tyson spoken to him? And about what? I remember perfectly well what I've said and done, I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. Someone used my credit card without permission. That's called theft, Tyson. Another pause. Look, let's talk about this when we get back, okay? I don't want to ruin our trip over a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? The words escaped before I could stop them. $53,000 is not a misunderstanding. 53. His voice trailed off. Mom, that's not. Zuri said it was just a few thousand for the hotel and some souvenirs. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear something shifting in his tone, a crack in the certainty that Zuri had fed him. Tyson, I said quietly, check your wife's luggage when you get back. Check her jewelry box. And then ask yourself if a few $1,000s could have bought what she's wearing in those photos she's been posting. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking so badly I could barely set the phone down. The silence that followed felt different from my usual loneliness. This wasn't the gentle quiet of an empty house. This was the hollow echo of betrayal. I'd spent 3 years trying to buy love that was never for sale, trying to earn acceptance from someone who saw me as nothing more than a convenient bank account. But as I stared at that credit card statement, something else began to simmer beneath the hurt. Something I hadn't felt in years, something that made me sit up straighter and reach for my reading glasses to examine those charges more carefully, because there was something Zuri didn't know about that particular credit card, something that might just change everything. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Zuri's smug smile from those Paris photos, heard the casual cruelty in her voice during countless family dinners. How had I been so blind? How had I let it go on for so long? The memories came flooding back like a dam had burst. The first warning sign should have been their wedding day itself, when Zuri had somehow forgotten to save me a seat at the family table. I'd spent the reception sitting with Harold's elderly cousins, watching my son dance with his new wife, while she pointedly avoided making eye contact with me. It was just an oversight, Tyson had insisted later when I gently mentioned it. Zuri was so stressed about the seating chart. You understand, right, Mom? I'd understood. I'd always understood. That had been my mistake. Then came the subtle exclusions from family photos. Oh, we were just taking a quick shot, Zuri would say whenever I'd noticed that somehow every candid moment had been captured without me in frame. We can take another one later. But later never came, and the photos that ended up on their social media told a story of a happy couple with no extended family at all. I remembered the first Christmas after their marriage, when I'd spent weeks knitting Zuri a beautiful cashmere scarf in her favorite color. She'd opened it in front of everyone, held it up for exactly 3 seconds, and said, "How thoughtful. I'm sure someone will love this." Then she'd set it aside and never mentioned it again. Later, I'd seen it hanging in their coat closet with the tags from Goodwill still attached, but the worst memory, the one that made my chest tighten with fresh pain, was from this past Mother's Day. I'd invited them over for brunch, spent the entire morning cooking Tyson's favorite meals from his childhood. Zuri had arrived wearing a stunning new dress and immediately started taking photos of the food I'd prepared. "This is so authentic," she'd said, posting pictures to her Instagram. Nothing like homemade cooking from the older generation. She'd made my food sound like a museum exhibit, my cooking like some quaint relic from a bygone era. But what had really stung was watching Tyson laugh and encourage her, completely oblivious to how his wife was diminishing me with every word. That same day, as we'd sat around the table, Zuri had started talking about their future plans. "Tyson and I have been thinking about buying a bigger house," she'd said, cutting her pancakes into perfect small bites. "Something more modern, you know, with better security." She'd glanced meaningfully around my modest home, the same house where Tyson had grown up, where Harold and I had built 38 years of memories. "Of course, we'd want to be close enough to help when Agatha needs us," she'd added with fake concern. "As people age, they really shouldn't be living alone. It's not safe. I'm perfectly fine living alone," I'd said quietly. "Oh, I know you think you are," Zuri had replied, her smile never wavering. "But things can change so quickly at your age. Memory issues, falls, confusion about medications. It's really something Tyson and I worry about constantly. I remembered how my son had nodded along, how he'd started looking at me with new eyes, not with love and familiarity, but with assessment. Was Mom getting forgetful? Was she becoming a burden? The seed had been planted, and Zuri had been watering it ever since. There was the time she'd helpfully reorganized my purse while I was in the bathroom at a restaurant, then made a show of how confused everything was inside. The way she'd started speaking louder to me in public, as if I were hard of hearing. The concerned comments about how I'd repeated a story I'd told just once, months earlier. And then there were the financial probes, always wrapped in concern, always presented as helpful suggestions. Have you thought about setting up automatic bill payments, Agatha? It would be so much easier for you. Maybe we should look into getting you a financial advisor, someone to help manage your accounts. Tyson could be added to your bank accounts just for emergencies. You know, in case something happens. I'd resisted most of these suggestions, some instinct warning me to keep my independence. But I'd been softening, wearing down under the constant pressure disguised as care. The worst part was how she'd used my grief against me. Every mention of Harold became an opportunity to remind everyone how fragile I was, how lost I seemed without him. She'd pat my hand sympathetically whenever his name came up, as if I were a wounded bird that might shatter at any moment. It's so hard when older people lose their partners, she'd say to friends and family members when she thought I couldn't hear. They sometimes lose touch with reality a little bit. It's completely understandable. But it does make you worry. Now, sitting in my kitchen at 3 a.m, I could see the pattern clearly. Every kind gesture I'd made had been twisted into evidence of my declining mental state. Every attempt to maintain my independence had been portrayed as dangerous stubbornness. Every gift, every gesture of love, had been cataloged as proof that I was an easy target. I pulled out my laptop and did something I should have done months ago. I logged into my bank accounts, all of them, and started reviewing the statements. What I found made my blood run cold. This wasn't the first time. There had been other charges over the past 6 months, smaller amounts, spread out enough that I hadn't noticed the pattern. A $800 charge at a high-end restaurant on a Tuesday when I was home alone. A $200 payment to a spa I'd never heard of. Multiple charges at boutiques, department stores, and luxury retailers. Someone had been using my credit cards for months, testing how much they could get away with before I noticed. The $53,000 shopping spree in Paris wasn't an impulsive crime of opportunity. It was the culmination of a carefully planned campaign. But as I scrolled through the charges, something else caught my attention. Something that made me sit back in my chair with a mixture of horror and growing determination. The card that had been used for most of these unauthorized purchases wasn't one of my personal credit cards. It was tied to an account I'd almost forgotten about. The business account for Whitmore and Associates, the consulting company Harold and I had built together 30 years ago. After Harold died, I'd stepped back from active management, but had never officially dissolved the business. Tyson had been helping me wrap up the final contracts and handle the remaining clients. He'd been signatory on the account, authorized to make purchases for business expenses, which meant that technically, legally, every charge Zuri had made wasn't just theft, it was corporate fraud. And corporate fraud, I remembered from my years running the business, carried much more serious consequences than simple credit card theft. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. For 3 years, I'd been playing defense, trying to accommodate and appease. I'd been so focused on not losing my son that I'd let his wife steal from me piece by piece. Dignity, and dollars both. But Zuri had made a crucial mistake. She'd gotten greedy, and in her greed, she'd used the wrong card. The card connected to a business that still existed, that still had legal protections and audit requirements, a business that was still, officially, mine. For the first time in months, I smiled, not the forced, pleasing smile I'd worn around Zuri, but something sharper, something with teeth. If she wanted to play games with an confused old woman, then perhaps it was time she learned that this particular old woman had been running a successful business since before Zuri was born. And I still remembered how to fight. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I put on my business suit. The navy blue Armani that Harold had bought me for our company's 10th anniversary still fit perfectly, though it felt strange after months of cardigans and comfortable slacks. I styled my silver hair the way I used to for board meetings, applied makeup with a steady hand, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the grieving widow Zuri had been so carefully cultivating. This was Agatha Whitmore, co-founder of a multi-million-dollar consulting firm, the woman who had negotiated contracts with Fortune 500 companies and never backed down from a fight. I'd forgotten her, but she was still there. My first stop was downtown, to the office building where Whitmore and Associates had maintained its headquarters for 25 years. I still had a key, though I hadn't used it in over a year. The receptionist, Maria, looked up in surprise when I walked through the glass doors. "Mrs. Whitmore, I wasn't expecting you today." "Good morning, Maria. I need to access the company files and speak with our accountant. Is Jennifer available?" "Of course, let me call her." Maria's fingers flew over her phone. "She'll be right down." Jennifer Morrison had been our company's financial advisor for over a decade. When she emerged from the elevator, her expression was carefully neutral, but I caught the flicker of concern in her eyes. "Agatha, it's good to see you. What brings you in?" "I need to review all recent transactions on the company credit cards, particularly any charges made in the past 6 months." I kept my voice level, professional. "I also need to understand our current audit requirements and fraud protection policies." Jennifer's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is there a problem?" "There may be. I'd prefer to review the documentation before we discuss specifics." She led me to the conference room where Harold and I used to meet with clients, the same room where we'd celebrated our biggest contracts and weathered our most challenging negotiations. The familiar surroundings steadied me, reminded me of who I'd been before grief had made me small. Jennifer spread the statements across the mahogany table, and together we went through every charge. What I'd discovered on my laptop the night before was just the beginning. The unauthorized purchases stretched back 8 months, starting small and growing bolder over time. "These charges," Jennifer said, pointing to a series of transactions, "they're all coded as business expenses. But I don't recognize most of these vendors." I studied the list. Designer boutiques, luxury spas, high-end restaurants. Nothing that could possibly be considered a legitimate business expense for a consulting firm that had been winding down operations. "The card was issued to Tyson Whitmore as an authorized user," Jennifer continued. "He has signing authority as part of the business transition planning we discussed last year. But he's not the one making these purchases." I pulled out my phone and showed her one of Zuri's Instagram photos from Paris, the one where she was wearing the diamond bracelet. That bracelet was purchased with the company card 3 weeks ago. $18,000 charged to client entertainment. Jennifer's expression darkened. "Agatha, if someone is using company funds for personal purchases and misrepresenting them as business expenses, that's not just theft. That's fraud. Corporate fraud. What are the implications? Federal charges, potentially. The IRS takes misuse of business accounts very seriously, especially when false documentation is involved." She leaned back in her chair. "We're talking about substantial fines, possible jail time, and complete destruction of professional reputation." I absorbed this information, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and dread. Satisfaction because finally, there would be consequences for Zuri's actions. Dread because those consequences might also touch my son. "What's our next step?" I asked. "We need to file a fraud report immediately. The company has to protect itself, and the longer we wait, the worse it looks for us." Jennifer's voice was firm. "I'll need to document everything and notify our legal team." "And Tyson?" "He's the authorized user." "That depends on whether he knew about the unauthorized charges. If he was complicit, he's equally liable. If he was unaware, he might be protected, but he'll still face serious questions about his oversight responsibilities." I stared at the statements spread across the table, thinking about my son. Had he known? Had he been aware that his wife was using company funds for her shopping sprees? Or was he as much a victim of her manipulation as I was? "I need to speak with him first," I said finally, "before we file anything official." 24 hours. Jennifer looked uncomfortable. "Agatha, I understand he's your son, But legally, the company has obligations. 24 hours, I repeated. Then we do whatever we have to do. She nodded reluctantly. But no more charges can be processed on that card. I'm freezing the account immediately. I spent the rest of the day in my old office, making calls and reviewing files. By evening, I had a complete picture of the damage and a plan for moving forward. Zuri had stolen nearly $75,000 over 8 months, all of it documented, all of it traceable. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I used the spare key Tyson had given me and let myself into his house while they were still in Paris. I wasn't there to snoop or gather evidence. I had plenty of that already. I was there to understand, to see how they lived, how they thought about money, how they saw their future. Their home was beautiful, I had to admit. Expensive furniture, artwork that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a year, a wine collection that belonged in a magazine. But as I moved through the rooms, I noticed something else. Bills, stacks of them, some marked past due, scattered across the kitchen counter like accusations. Credit card statements showing balances that made my theft pale in comparison, mortgage payments that were months behind, a notice from their car dealership about missed payments on Zuri's BMW. They were drowning in debt, living a lifestyle they couldn't afford, maintaining appearances that were slowly strangling them financially. And my money, my company's money, had been keeping them afloat. I found Zuri's jewelry box in their bedroom, a massive thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. It was filled with pieces I recognized from the credit card statements. The diamond earrings from March, the pearl necklace from April, the tennis bracelet from May, a timeline of theft, displayed like trophies. But it was what I found in the bottom drawer that truly shocked me. A folder labeled Financial Planning that contained detailed research about my assets. Printouts of property records showing the value of my house, copies of Harold's obituary with his business accomplishments highlighted, internet searches about inheritance laws and power of attorney procedures. At the bottom of the folder was a handwritten note in Zuri's careful script, timeline, establish pattern of confusion, memory issues, get added to accounts by summer, POA by Christmas, full access within 18 months. My hands shook as I read it again. 18 months. She'd been planning this for 18 months, systematically working to take control of everything Harold and I had built together. The credit card theft wasn't impulsive greed. It was a test run for something much more comprehensive. I photographed the documents with my phone, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid the camera would shake. Then I carefully replaced everything exactly as I'd found it, and left their house. Back home, I poured myself a glass of Harold's best scotch and sat in his old chair, thinking. Zuri wasn't just a manipulative daughter-in-law. She was a predator who had identified me as prey and had been systematically hunting me for over a year. But she'd made one crucial error in her planning. She'd assumed I was exactly what I appeared to be, a lonely, grief-stricken widow who would be grateful for any attention and easily controlled. She'd never considered that under that widow lived a woman who had built and run a successful business for 30 years. A woman who understood contracts and leverage and the art of negotiation. A woman who had just discovered that her opponent had been playing checkers while she was about to unleash chess. My phone buzzed. A text from Tyson. Flying home tomorrow. We should talk. I smiled as I typed my response. Yes, we should. Come by Sunday evening. Bring Zuri. There's something we all need to discuss. I hit send and finished Harold's scotch. Sunday was going to be very interesting indeed. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of autumn chill that made me grateful for the warmth of my kitchen. I'd spent the day cooking Tyson's favorite meal, pot roast with all the fixings, the same dinner I'd made for his homecoming since he was a boy. But tonight wasn't about nostalgia. Tonight was about truth. They arrived exactly on time, Zuri looking radiant in what I now recognized as a new designer outfit, probably purchased with my stolen money. Her diamond bracelet caught the light as she hugged me, the same bracelet I'd seen itemized on the company credit card statement. Agatha, you look wonderful, she said, her voice honey-sweet. I hope you weren't too worried about us. I know you can get anxious when you can't reach Tyson. The subtle dig was perfectly delivered, designed to reinforce the narrative of an anxious, dependent mother. I smiled and nodded, playing my part for just a little longer. I'm so glad you're both home safely. Come, sit down. Dinner's ready. As we settled around the dining table, I studied my son's face. He looked tired, stressed in a way that hadn't been there before their trip. His eyes kept darting between Zuri and me, and I could see the internal struggle playing out. Something had shifted during their time in Paris. So tell me about your trip, I said, serving the pot roast. It looked absolutely beautiful from the photos. Zuri launched into an elaborate description of their hotel, the restaurants, the shopping. She was animated, glowing, describing each luxury in perfect detail, but I noticed she was careful to avoid mentioning specific costs. The suite was incredible, she said, cutting her meat into precise small pieces. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Eiffel Tower. And the shopping. Oh, Agatha, you would have loved some of the boutiques. So elegant, so sophisticated. I'm sure, I replied. And the jewelry. That bracelet is stunning. She held up her wrist, letting the diamonds catch the light. This old thing? I've had it forever, though I did pick up a few new pieces while we were there. You know how it is. When in Paris. The lie rolled off her tongue so easily, so naturally. I glanced at Tyson, wondering if he'd caught it, but his expression was unreadable. Actually, I said carefully, I wanted to talk to you both about something. I've been reviewing some financial statements and I found some unusual charges. Zuri's fork paused halfway to her mouth, but her smile never wavered. Oh? What kind of charges? Credit card purchases I don't remember making. Large amounts. I'm wondering if perhaps someone gained access to one of my cards. The silence that followed was electric. Tyson set down his fork and looked directly at his wife. Zuri, didn't you say Mom gave you permission to use her card for the trip? I watched Zuri's face carefully. For just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. Then the mask was back in place, complete with wounded innocence. Of course she did. Agatha, surely you remember our conversation. You insisted on treating us for our anniversary. You said it was your gift to us. What conversation was that? I asked gently. The one we had last Sunday after dinner. You walked me to the car and pressed the card into my hands. You said you wanted us to have a special trip, that Harold would have wanted you to be generous with family. The invocation of Harold's name was a masterstroke, designed to make me doubt myself, to make any challenge seem like a betrayal of my late husband's memory. It was exactly the kind of manipulation I'd been falling for. But not tonight. That's interesting, I said, pulling a folder from the sideboard behind me. Because according to these records, the card you used wasn't one of my personal credit cards. I spread the statements across the table between us, watching both their faces as they processed what they were seeing. These charges were made to the Whitmore and Associates business account, the consulting company your father and I built together, Tyson, the company that's still legally active, still subject to federal audit requirements. Tyson's face went pale. Mom, I don't understand. You said the business was being wound down. It is. But it's not dissolved. Which means every purchase made on company accounts has to be documented as a legitimate business expense. I pointed to the Paris hotel charges. Can you explain how a luxury suite in Paris qualifies as a business expense for a consulting firm? Zuri's composure finally cracked. This is ridiculous. You're making a big deal out of nothing. It was just a credit card mix-up. $75,000 isn't a mix-up, Zuri. It's fraud. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Tyson pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. 75,000? Mom, you said 53 on the phone. That was just the Paris charges. There have been unauthorized purchases for months. I pulled out additional statements, spreading them across the table like evidence in a courtroom. March 15th, Le Bernardin Restaurant, $800. March 22nd, Elizabeth Arden Spa, $1,200. April 3rd, Nordstrom, $2,600. With each date and amount, Zuri seemed to shrink smaller in her chair. But Tyson was growing larger, his shoulders squaring as understanding dawned. You've been using Mom's business account for months? His voice was deadly quiet. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, Zuri said, her voice losing its confident tone. She has plenty of money. The business was just sitting there doing nothing. The business that could send us both to federal prison if the IRS decides we're running a fraud scheme? Tyson's voice rose. The business that I'm authorized on? Zuri, do you have any idea what you've done? What I've done? Her voice turned sharp, defensive. What about what she's done? Sitting on all that money while we're drowning in debt. Living in that big house all alone while we can barely make our mortgage payments. She's your mother. She should want to help us. By stealing from her, Tyson stood up, pacing to the window. By forging business expenses? By making me an accessory to fraud? I watched the scene unfold with a mixture of sadness and relief. My son was finally seeing his wife clearly, but it was costing him everything he thought he knew about his marriage. There's more, I said quietly, pulling out my phone. I showed them the photos I'd taken of Zuri's planning documents. I found these in your house. Tyson took the phone, scrolling through the images. With each photo, his expression grew harder, more distant. When he reached the timeline document, he actually laughed, but it was a sound devoid of humor. Power of attorney by Christmas, he read aloud. Full access within 18 months. He looked up at his wife, and I could see the exact moment his love died. You were planning to take everything. Not just from Mom, but from me too. Once you had control of her assets, how long before you decided you didn't need me anymore? Zuri's face was flushed now, her careful composure completely gone. It's not like that. I love you, Tyson. I was doing this for us. For our future. No, he said, his voice steady and cold. You were doing this for you. You've been lying to me for months, maybe years, making me think Mom was getting confused, that she needed us to take care of her finances. You turned me against my own mother. She was never there for you growing up. Zuri's voice turned desperate, vicious, working all the time, leaving you with babysitters. She doesn't deserve your loyalty. Stop. The word came out like a whip crack. Tyson's face was stone. Don't you dare talk about my mother that way. She worked to provide for us after Dad died. She built a business that put me through college, that gave us the foundation for everything we have. Everything we had, Zuri corrected bitterly. Because now we're going to lose it all, aren't we? The house, the cars, everything. All because you can't stand up to your precious mommy. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 65 years. Actually, Zuri, that depends entirely on what happens next. Both of them turned to look at me. Tyson with hope, Zuri with calculation. I've spoken with our company's legal team. The fraud report hasn't been filed yet. The charges could still be resolved as a family matter, repaid with interest and penalties. No criminal charges, no federal investigation. What's the catch? Zuri asked, because she was smart enough to know there would be one. I looked at my son, seeing Harold's integrity in his eyes, the same moral compass that had made me fall in love with his father. The catch is that this ends now, all of it. The manipulation, the lies, the theft. And there are going to be consequences. I could feel the tide turning, the power dynamic shifting back to where it belonged. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't the vulnerable widow begging for scraps of affection. I was Agatha Whitmore, and I was done being anyone's victim. The silence in my dining room stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Zuri sat rigid in her chair, her designer dress suddenly looking like armor that hadn't quite protected her. Tyson stood by the window, his reflection ghost-like in the dark glass, shoulders bent under the weight of everything he'd just learned. What kind of consequences? Zuri asked, her voice carefully controlled, but I could hear the fear underneath. I walked to my desk and retrieved a manila folder I'd prepared earlier. Inside were documents that would change everything. Contracts, legal papers, and financial statements that told the real story of the past 3 years. First, I said, settling back into my chair with the folder in my lap, you're going to return every single item purchased with company funds. Every piece of jewelry, every designer outfit, every luxury item. I have photographs and receipts for all of it. Zuri's hand instinctively went to her diamond bracelet. That's impossible. Some of these things were gifts, or I've already worn them, or then you'll return what you can and pay cash for what you can't, I interrupted. At full retail value, not what you might get selling them secondhand. With what money? She snapped, her mask finally slipping completely. You know we don't have that kind of cash. Then you'll figure it out, get a job, sell your car, downsize your lifestyle. I opened the folder and pulled out the first document. Because the alternative is federal fraud charges, and I don't think orange is really your color. Tyson turned from the window, his face haggard. Mom, what else? You said consequences, plural. This was the hard part, the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. I pulled out a second set of papers. Zuri will sign a promissory note for the full amount stolen, plus interest and penalties. $78,467, to be repaid over 5 years at market interest rates. That's almost $16,000 a year. Zuri's voice rose to a near shriek. We can't afford that. You should have thought of that before you decided to finance your lifestyle with my money. I kept my voice level, professional. But there's more. You'll also sign a statement admitting to the unauthorized use of company funds, which I'll hold as insurance against future misunderstandings. Zuri's face had gone pale beneath her expertly applied makeup. You're trying to destroy me. No, Zuri, you destroyed yourself. I'm just making sure you can't destroy anyone else. I pulled out the final document, the one that would hurt the most but was absolutely necessary. And you'll agree to have no contact with me moving forward. No family dinners, no holiday gatherings, no attempts at reconciliation. You'll stay away from my home, my business, and my life. You can't do that. Zuri shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the floor. You can't cut me off from family. What about Tyson? What about any future grandchildren? I looked at my son, seeing the pain in his eyes, but also something else, relief. As if a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying was finally lifting. Tyson is my son, and he'll always be welcome in my home. But you've proven that you can't be trusted, and I won't subject myself to further manipulation. This is insane, Zuri said, pacing now like a caged animal. You're breaking up our marriage over money, over a misunderstanding. I'm not breaking up anything, I replied calmly. I'm simply protecting myself from someone who has spent the last 3 years systematically trying to steal everything my husband and I worked for. What you and Tyson decide to do about your marriage is between the two of you. Tyson finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. She's right, Zuri. About all of it. Tyson, you can't seriously be taking her side. There are no sides here, he said, turning to face his wife fully. There's right and wrong. And what you did was wrong. Not just the stealing, but the lying, the manipulation, trying to turn me against my own mother. Zuri's expression shifted, becoming pleading, desperate. Baby, please. I made some mistakes, yes, but I was doing it for us, for our future. Your mother has more money than she could ever spend, and we're struggling. I was just trying to even things out. By committing fraud? By planning to have her declared incompetent so you could steal everything? Tyson's voice was getting louder, 3 years of suppressed frustration finally finding its voice. I read those documents, Zuri, your timeline, your plans. You weren't trying to help our marriage. You were planning to get rid of me too once you had control of Mom's assets. That's not true. Then explain the research about divorce settlements in the same folder. Explain why you were looking up how to protect assets during dissolution of marriage proceedings. Zuri's mouth opened and closed silently. She'd been caught, completely and thoroughly, and for the first time since I'd known her, she had no clever response. I stood up, feeling stronger than I had in years. You have 48 hours to decide. Sign the agreements and we handle this privately, or I file the fraud report and let the federal government sort it out. Your choice. And if I refuse? If I call your bluff? I smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. Try me. I spent 30 years in business, Zuri. I've negotiated with corporate executives who would eat you for breakfast and use your bones as toothpicks. You're not nearly as intimidating as you think you are. Something in my tone must have convinced her because her defiant posture crumpled. She looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. Really seeing it. The family photos that didn't include her. The comfortable, lived-in furniture that spoke of decades of genuine happiness. The evidence of a life built on love and hard work, rather than manipulation and theft. "This isn't over," she said finally, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," I replied. "It's been over since the moment you decided to steal from me. You just didn't realize it yet." Zuri grabbed her purse and stalked toward the door, then turned back one final time. "You'll regret this, both of you. When you're sitting alone in this house with no family left, you'll remember this night. I've been alone for 3 years, Zuri. The only difference is now I won't have to pretend otherwise." She slammed the door hard enough to rattle the windows. In the silence that followed, Tyson and I stood looking at each other across the debris of our shattered family. "Mom," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I should have seen it. Should have protected you." I walked to him and took his hands in mine, the same hands I'd held when he was a frightened little boy having nightmares. "You were manipulated by someone very skilled at it. She's probably been practicing for years, on other people, in other relationships. But I should have known. You're my mother. I should have trusted you over her. Grief makes us all vulnerable, sweetheart. After your father died, I was vulnerable too. I wanted so badly to be included in your new life that I ignored the warning signs. We both made mistakes." He pulled me into a hug then, the kind of fierce, desperate embrace we'd shared at Harold's funeral. When he finally stepped back, his eyes were wet but determined. "What happens now? With you and me, I mean." I looked at my son, really looked at him. At some point during the evening, the stranger who'd been wearing his face for the past 3 years had disappeared, and my real son had returned. The boy who'd helped me plant roses after his father died. The young man who'd called me every week during his first year of college. The son who'd promised to always take care of me. Now we figure out how to be a family again. Just the two of us. The way it should have been all along. He nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "And Zuri?" "Zuri will do what she's always done. She'll land on her feet, find someone new to manipulate, start the cycle over again. But that's not our problem anymore." The next morning, Tyson moved back into his childhood bedroom. 3 days later, the signed agreements appeared on my doorstep with no accompanying note. Within a week, boxes began arriving at my house. Jewelry, designer clothes, expensive shoes. All the trophies of Zuri's theft being returned. She'd kept her word, but then again, she hadn't really had a choice. The divorce papers were filed 2 weeks later, citing irreconcilable differences. Zuri didn't contest it, which told me everything I needed to know about how much our little talk had rattled her. But the real victory wasn't in the returned money or the signed confessions. It was in getting my son back, in reclaiming the relationship that had been stolen from us both. And as I watched Tyson help me plant new roses in Harold's garden, I realized something important. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't fighting back. It's refusing to keep fighting a battle you were never meant to lose. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making Sunday breakfast for 2, something I hadn't done since Harold passed away. The morning light streamed through windows I'd finally gotten around to cleaning properly, and the house felt alive again in a way it hadn't for years. Tyson emerged from his old bedroom, hair still messy from sleep, wearing the same ratty college t-shirt he'd insisted on keeping since he was 20. For a moment, it was like the past 3 years had been nothing but a bad dream. "Morning, Mom. Coffee smells amazing. Sit down. Breakfast is almost ready." I plated the eggs and bacon, noting how much healthier he looked now. The stress lines around his eyes had faded, and he'd gained back some of the weight he'd lost during the final months of his marriage. "Any word from Jennifer about the final payment?" he asked, settling into his chair. "It came through yesterday, the last installment." I poured orange juice into his glass, the same ritual we'd shared when he was a teenager. "Zuri's officially paid back every cent, with interest. And the business account? Officially closed. Whitmore and Associates is finally, formally dissolved." I sat down across from him, feeling lighter than I had in years. "Your father would have been proud of how we handled everything." Tyson nodded, but I could see the shadow that still crossed his face whenever we talked about Zuri. The divorce had been finalized 3 months ago, but I knew he was still processing the betrayal, still coming to terms with how completely he'd been deceived. Have you heard from her at all? I asked gently. A few texts in the beginning, trying to get me to work things out, claiming you'd forced her into confessing to things she didn't do. He shook his head, but nothing for the past month. I think she's finally accepted it's over. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Zuri had moved to California, supposedly engaged to a man 30 years her senior with considerable real estate holdings. The pattern was repeating itself, just as I'd predicted, but that wasn't my concern anymore. I have something to tell you, I said, setting down my coffee cup. I've been thinking about selling the house. Tyson's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Really? Why? It's too big for me now, and honestly, there are too many memories tied up in these walls. Some good, some not so good. I think it's time for a fresh start. Where would you go? I smiled, feeling a flutter of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. I've been looking at condos downtown near the waterfront. There's a beautiful place with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Much more manageable for someone my age. That sounds perfect for you, he said, and I could hear the genuine happiness in his voice. You deserve to live somewhere that makes you excited to wake up in the morning. What about you? Have you thought about what comes next? Tyson had been living with me since the separation, and while I loved having him here, I knew it wasn't a permanent solution. He was 34 years old and needed to rebuild his own life. Actually, I've been meaning to talk to you about that too. He set down his fork and looked at me directly. I got a job offer, a good one, tell me. It's with Morrison Consulting downtown. They want me to head up their new digital transformation division. It's exactly the kind of work I've wanted to do, and the salary is. He paused. It's enough that I could actually afford a decent place on my own. That's wonderful, sweetheart. When do you start? Next month if I take it. But I wanted to make sure you'd be okay on your own first. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. Tyson, I've been taking care of myself for 65 years. I think I can manage a little while longer. I know, but after everything that happened with Zuri, I worry about leaving you vulnerable to what? Another manipulative daughter-in-law? I laughed, surprising myself with how genuine it sounded. Honey, I learned my lesson. The next woman you bring home is going to have to pass much more rigorous inspection. The next woman I bring home is going to have to understand that my mother is a force of nature who's not to be underestimated, he said with a grin. I think that'll weed out most of the gold diggers. After breakfast, we drove to the waterfront condo I'd been considering. The real estate agent, a pleasant woman named Sarah, met us in the lobby of a converted warehouse building that had been transformed into luxury residential units. This is the one I mentioned, she said, leading us to the elevator. 10th floor, corner unit, spectacular views. When she opened the door, I heard Tyson's sharp intake of breath. The space was stunning. Open concept, modern kitchen, hardwood floors, and windows that showcased the harbor like a living painting. Mom, this is incredible, he said, walking to the windows. Look at that view. I joined him, watching sailboats drift across the blue water like white birds. For the first time in years, I could picture myself somewhere new, somewhere that belonged entirely to me. The building has excellent security, Sarah continued. A fitness center, a rooftop garden, and a concierge service. It's very popular with professional women who want luxury without the maintenance headaches of a house. What's the HOA situation? I asked, because Harold had taught me to always understand the hidden costs. Very reasonable for what you get. About $400 a month, covers all utilities except cable and internet, plus all the amenities. I walked through the bedroom, noting the walk-in closet and spa-like bathroom. Everything was clean, modern, efficient. Nothing like the rambling house where I'd raised Tyson, but that was exactly what I wanted. I'll take it, I said. Sarah blinked. Don't you want to see some comparable units? Think about it for a few days? I've been thinking about it for months. This is perfect. 3 weeks later, I signed the papers. 2 weeks after that, the moving trucks arrived at my old house. Tyson had taken a few days off from his new job to help with the transition, and we worked side by side sorting through 40 years of accumulated memories. What about this? He asked, holding up a photo from his high school graduation. Zuri had insisted on taking it, cutting me partially out of the frame so she could stand closer to Tyson. Trash, I said without hesitation. And this one? A family photo from last Christmas. All of us smiling stiffly around the tree. Trash. Mom, you're throwing away everything that has Zuri in it. Exactly. I'm not keeping reminders of someone who tried to destroy our family. He was quiet for a moment, then held up another photo, just the two of us at Harold's grave on the first anniversary of his death. What about this one? I took it from him, studying our faces. We both looked lost, grieving, but we were together. Real in a way that none of the later photos with Zuri had ever been. That one goes in my bedroom. By evening, the house was empty except for the few pieces of furniture the new owners had agreed to purchase. I stood in the living room where I'd spent so many evenings with Harold, where I'd raised my son, where I'd been systematically diminished by a woman who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to overcome. Any regrets? Tyson asked, joining me in the doorway. None, I said, and meant it completely. The condo felt like a sanctuary. Everything in it was chosen by me, for me, without having to consider anyone else's preferences or needs. I decorated it simply but elegantly, with artwork I loved and furniture that was comfortable rather than impressive. On my first evening there, I sat on my new sofa with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the harbor in shades of gold and pink. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyson. How's the first night in the new place? I typed back, perfect. Absolutely perfect. Dinner Sunday? I found this great little Italian place. It's a date, but I'm buying. I want to celebrate my freedom. 3 months into my new life, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I joined a book club, then a photography class, then a walking group that met every Tuesday morning at the waterfront. I was making friends again. Real friends who knew me as Agatha the individual, not Agatha the mother or Agatha the victim. Women who had their own interesting stories, their own accomplishments, their own perspectives on life. One evening, as I was coming back from book club, I found Tyson waiting in my lobby with a bottle of champagne and a huge grin. What are we celebrating? I asked. My promotion, and your freedom, and the fact that we both survived the worst thing that ever happened to our family and came out stronger. We went up to my condo and opened the champagne on my balcony, watching the lights begin to twinkle across the water. I love you, Mom, he said suddenly, and I'm sorry it took me so long to find my way back to who I really am. I love you too, sweetheart, and I'm not sorry about any of it. Really? Not even the stolen money? Not even that. Because if Zuri hadn't gotten so greedy, if she hadn't made that one crucial mistake with the business account, she might have succeeded. She might have actually gotten power of attorney, taken control of everything, maybe even had me declared incompetent. I took a sip of champagne, feeling the bubbles dance on my tongue. Instead, she taught me that I'm much stronger than I thought I was, that I don't need to accept crumbs of affection from people who don't really love me, that I can build a life that's entirely my own. So, what comes next? I smiled, looking out at the harbor where boats moved freely across the water, untethered and heading toward whatever destination they chose. Whatever I want. For the first time in my adult life, whatever I want. And for the first time in years, that felt like the greatest gift of all. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.